Hello everyone and welcome back to another devlog for Fatal Knockout. This one is going to be a bit different. It's going to be a bit of a retrospective because with this game it's not been the case of where anytime I get some sort of idea or concept I whip out the camera and start like documenting it just in case, because first off, like, there will be a million videos and they would all be really really long because I think about this game and work on this game constantly. But also that sounds like a lot of editing work, and as you can probably tell by my videos I don't really like to edit too much. But yeah, so this video is going to be about designing asymmetry into games. Games in general. I'm going to specifically talk about a Fatal Knockout for a lot of this video. But I've made multiple asymmetric games before. Food Time Battle in Space in particular was a very, very asymmetric game which took a lot of balancing, which I'll get into later. Landscape had hints of balancing, but I've done blog posts and articles before about asymmetric games, and I feel like I have a lot to talk about with it. So this is going to be not like it's going to be like sort of like a mini series of like, this is going to be like one of maybe 3 videos about different sort of aspects of asymmetry, what to look out for, the pitfalls of it, which there are many, but also there are many, many positives and reasons as to why you should consider making an asymmetric game. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the benefits. So, I mean, one of the main things is increased variability between game to game. The variability comes from players playing different characters or playing different, factions or whatever it is. Like Root, for example, has a lot of variability because of the factions in it. With Fatal Knockout, the variability comes from the different fighters. But not only does the variability come from the fighters or the characters or the factions or whoever that you play, but also the combinations of them and the matchups between them. So, I don't know, in like Scythe, for example, there's a bunch of different factions. Games could play completely differently if it's a 2-player game and there's like 2 different factions, and then next game there's players completely pick 2 completely separate factions and play again. The game's going to be different, and that's the same with Fatal Knockout as well. And that's kind of like the bread and butter of Fatal Knockout, is that every single game is going to be different depending on the matchups. And with the more fighters which are being added before launch, that variability is going to be huge, and that's one of the main benefits. However, the core, and I've already mentioned this, the core negative and the core con of making an asymmetric game is the amount of time you're going to have to put into playtesting, and you're going to have to put into balancing, because an asymmetric game is great when it's balanced, and you're never going to get a perfectly balanced asymmetric game unless your game doesn't have enough variabilities, variables to make it engaging. If it can be balanced within, I don't know, like 100 playtests, then it probably doesn't have enough variables to make that variation, to make that asymmetry interesting and worthwhile and engaging. So there's a lot of balancing ahead of you if you want to do it. But yeah, so this is how. Now I'm going to talk about how I sort of designed asymmetry into Fatal Knockout. It was always going to be an asymmetric game. There was always going to be variables which I'd use to make every single fighter different, because that's the point of fighting games, is that every single fighter is different. So with Fatal Knockout, if I open OBS quickly, and just go to the tabletop simulator. Sorry, it's a bit messy. I've got like 6 or 7 like prototype fighters on the go at the moment, which are using duplicate arts, and I've got other stuff which I'll talk about in a different video to do with maybe single player, solo, who knows. But yeah, anyway. So one of the first things which I did is that I looked at fighting games, and I looked at how I could translate a fighting game into a tabletop game, and then I identified how many variables I could play with when it came to designing the game. Like, what are variables? So variables are like things which can be changed, like primarily statistics, which can affect the game. So, for example, if I just take a random deck, if I take the Zona deck, and I flip through the cards, they are primarily like a more low initiative cards. Like there's a lot of 2s and 3s and 4s. Like initiative is the number in the top left. Also, we'll take a grappler. Hopefully, we will see that there is maybe more high initiative cards. Like you can see that as I'm flicking through, it's more like 4s, 5s, 6s, and that's because the average initiative between these two decks is different. The average initiative, I think, for the Zoner is 5.1, and the average initiative for the Grappler is 6. So that means that the way this game is played is that the lower initiative goes first. So the reason why I did that is to sort of mimic speed and agility in fighting games, like in frame data. So the Zoner is on average going to be quicker. However, from turn to turn, that might not seem that way. But then, say for example, you have like 3 turns where the Grappler's quicker, you can have like 5 or 6 turns where the Zoner is quicker. You know, that's just the way it's going to go. And the way I identified it in the guide book, which is very preliminary at the moment, I'm going to be updating these, is that I did some statistics. So as you can see here, the initiative is much lower in the Zoner than it is in the Grappler. There's a bunch of other stuff here to do with variabilities, which I'll talk about now. So like other variables which I identified is like how much damage can they do. This is not just like how much damage can a particular ability do, because some abilities can do 2 damage in this game instead of 1. But more so how many damage cards, how many opportunities are there for fighters to do damage. As you can see, the Grappler has more opportunities than the Zoner. The movement is lower for the Grappler, but the Zoner also has quite bad movement because they're not really about moving. And then utility is more about sort of like any sort of variable outside of doing damage. Like, for example, the Grappler has the grab, which does damage, but one of the cool things about the grab is that it flips you over the Grappler, but it maintains your orientation. So, for example, you could be facing the Grappler here, and they flip you over, and now you're facing away. And that's a huge, huge disadvantage in this game. If you're facing away from your opponent, you're at a massive disadvantage, and that's why the utility isn't just 1. But for the Zoner, they have loads of utility when it comes to zoning out players, as well as like keeping them at bay, and also doing damage when they're in the right range, you know, that sort of thing. And so these are just some of the stats, but also like there's other things as well, like how many symbols have we got in the top right, which like indicate like different ways you can use cards, how many like super moves they've got, how much meter gain they get. Meter is something which I haven't talked about in a Fatal Knockout devlog, and I probably will make a separate video just for the meter, but it's not quite done yet. But I'm trying to mimic meters in fighting games. I think I've also picked up a reference card here. But yeah, like meter gain is one of them as well. How many rotates they have, you know, there's like loads and loads of different stats is the point. But let's talk about what I wanted to keep the same, because that's like quite a big part of asymmetry. It's like, okay, so you've got a bunch of different ways you can make cards different, and you can make characters different or factions different, but what's going to be the way that players can like keep a foothold in the game and not make them have to learn an entirely new game every time they play a different character, because that'll make people just want to stick to the same character. That's why in Disney Villainous sometimes I stick to the same character, because there's almost like slightly too much variability because of how different each character can be, which is something which I wanted to avoid with this one. I wanted them to just be able to flick through the quick guidebook really quickly, read through like the one new mechanic that the fighter has got, and then be like, okay, I will probably play around this because that's what it's designed to do. So, one of the 2 things which I wanted to keep the same was health. That might slightly vary with like one fighter, just because in a lot of fighting games there is a glass cannon fighter, which is a fighter which has less health but more damage. That would just be for one fighter though. For every other fighter, I'll keep it 5 health, or maybe 6 health. That changes, you know. At the moment, it's 5 health, and it seems to be doing quite well. And then the second variable is deck size. Everyone's deck size is going to be 14, with the ability using the meter to add a super move in to their deck to make it 15. And that means that everyone sort of has the same possibility space for their toolkit. Like when I'm designing the decks, I can only design as many as 14 cards plus a super move, which is just a better version of their best card but for a lower initiative. And that really it gives people that consistency to be comfortable with learning, if that makes sense. Because they know the rules, they know how this fighter's probably going to play. They're probably going to have some movement cards, some attack cards. They've got some consistency, but then when they play them, they realise that there's a difference, and then they learn through playing. Rather than with like Villainous, for example, where you can't really win unless you study the character before you start. So the only reason why I'm selecting Villainous is because Villainous is one of my favourite asymmetric games. It's just that there's a couple of gripes that I have with it, but it's still great. And so like I've talked about like what things I wanted different. Like for example, like just to recap, the initiative range, different card abilities, obviously, different amounts of types of abilities. So like for example, the rushdown character, which is this one, well, it has way more movement cards, as you probably see as I'm flicking through, way more movement cards than the other fighters. So I wanted them to have like different types of abilities, because you can see here as well with the guidebook, like the movement is just like through the roof, like it's 5 out of 5 because of just how good the movement is. I also wanted them to have different meters as well, but I'll get into meters later. Like you can see here with the Zona, they have a retrieve weapon. Part of the meter, they have a couple of shields. The stance fighter can change stance multiple times. That sort of thing. The rushdown can interrupt a lot, you know, that sort of thing. And then finally, I wanted every single fighter to have one unique mechanic. For example, the grappler has grab, the zoner has the ability to throw their weapon and leave it on ground and do damage from that weapon. The rushdown has the interrupt, which is unique to them. And the stance character has the ability to change stances. And the reason why I wanted this is because it's like that extra layer of variability. But this is something which, I don't know if I coined this phrase or whatever, but it's something which I like, is one of my major sort of design philosophies that I stick by, is pocket rules. Because one of the issues with a lot of games is that you have to learn every single rule, even if it's not massively relevant to how you're going to play that game. However, if you make the game asymmetric and make each faction or fighter or character purposefully play differently, then you can incorporate all the mechanics you wanted, but only teach certain mechanics to the players where it's relevant to. For example, in the quick guide, and also probably on the back of their reference card when I get around to it, the only character which will have an explanation to interrupt will be the rushdown. And then, like, say the rushdown, the guy playing the rushdown is playing against someone who has never played against rushdown before, and they see the interrupt, and then all that happens is they'll be like, oh, what does that do? Quick explanation, done, that sort of thing. You don't need to like sift through this rulebook. And when there's like 6+ fighters in this game, I'm gonna have to make like a couple of pages in the rulebook just to explain every single ability, when really I don't have to. I can just stick it in the quick guide so that only the player which it affects has to learn it. And pocket rules are insanely good for not overwhelming the players, because it's just so simple and it just makes sense. Like, why would you have to teach rules to every single player when it's not relevant to them currently? You know, it's the same sort of principle that Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion did, where they're like, oh, you don't really need to know about all these rules when you're just learning about like killing some basic like grunts. We'll introduce these rules to you later. Like, that's another version of pocket rules, which isn't particularly about like variability or anything like that, but it's more so about just not overwhelming the player, because there's a lot of rules in that game. However, with this game, there could just be loads of rules in this game as well if I wasn't careful. And that's something which you have to pay attention to with asymmetric games, because if the primary way you make factions or characters or whatever asymmetric is through the introduction of new mechanics, kind of what I did, then you need to make sure that like all players don't have to learn it, because that would just be a death sentence really to the game. And that is pretty much it. Like, I've talked about the reason why similarities and consistency is important, and to allow players to have like sort of that foothold in the game and feel like they understand the basics, but like want to learn this like extra rule or two with this new fighter. And at the same time, they also like picking new fighters because it's something new, you know, like it's something new to learn. Who knows? They might have just got walloped by that fighter, and they're like, I want to know how that fighter works. So maybe I play as them, or I know how to beat them next time. And that just adds so much variability because, like, the difference between a grappler and a zoner match, or a stance and a grappler match, or a rushdown and a zoner match, you know, like these are just the basic four fighters, and there's going to be at least two more before the Kickstarter launches, plus potentially more than that, you know. And it's just going to be so much variability, and it's going to be great. But yeah, so that is a quick video. Well, it turned out a bit longer than a quick video. I was expecting it to be under 10 minutes, to be honest, on asymmetric games. So what to look out for, how to design them, make sure you identify those stats which you've got in your design, and see how many ways you can vary them. And we also talked about the fact that you need to keep some stuff consistent, and also pocket rules as well. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you guys for watching. If you are interested in Fatal Knockout at all, the pre-launch link for the Kickstarter is in the description. There is also the Board Game Geek page that if you want to like wishlist or whatever, that'll be super awesome. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I shall see you in the next one. Goodbye.